Hello everyone. Before I start, I would like to mention my background. I'm a telecommunications engineer, which means that when I think about neuroscience, I tend to think in terms of code, signals, things like that. Now, one of the tools that has been very widespread in neuroscience is information theory, which allows you to measure how much information is sent between parts of the brain, or who communicates to whom, and so on. However, one of the problems that is often misunderstood in this field is that the theorems of Shannon, the foundation of information theory, is asymptotic, at least in the way we use them. And that means that basically it considers how can we compress or encode long sequences that are infinitely long. Now we obviously can, that requires infinite hardware, so infinite memory and infinite computer power. But if we want to do it in the real world, that's not really a problem. What we do is that we take shorter sequences and we encode those. It's not exactly the same as the theorems propose, but it works fairly well. Now, however, when we want to use to study this in biology, or if we wanted to do that with neurons, we would face a problem. And that is that in computers or in chips, we have registers, we have things that we put stuff in, and it will stay there as long as we need it to. So it's not that we have a finite memory in the sense of an electronic system, but we have a fading memory. Meaning, I can remember what happened yesterday, more or less, but not with perfect precision, whereas a computer would either remember it or not. So the question is then, how can we actually have a good code in this setup where we have fading memory? Okay, before I jump into the actual results, just a quick word about the models. For simulations and for most of the theory, I use these very simple models, so the leak, integrate, and fire neuron. Nothing particularly weird about it, I guess you're all familiar with it. Spike in time-dependent plasticity. It's been experimentally observed. It's one of the most known models of how neurons change their connections. And the architecture that I'll be using is this. Basically, I'll have neurons that will get a train of spikes. So at time 0, a stimulus starts, and they get a spike train from different synapses. Now, those spikes arrive always at the same time, so every time I restart my system, I repeat my stimulus, the spikes arrive at the same time. They can be jitter, there can be noise, whatever, but it's important that there's some sort of temporal consistency across repetitions. Given that spike type plasticity, it's depending on time, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Now, the phenomena that I propose, or not that I propose, but I think is behind most of the stuff that I'll be presenting, is the so-called latency reduction. Loosely speaking, that means that neurons try to fire as early as possible. I'm not the first one to say that. It's in those two references, but it's something that's accepted, particularly in the hippocampus. And the main idea is this scheme that you see here. If I have 3 neurons, and neuron A fires, and then B fires, and then those two create a spike in C, the connection from A to C would get stronger every time. So after many repetitions, the weight of the connection AC would be strong enough to generate a spike in C before the spike in B. So C would fire before B does earlier. Now, this works fairly well for single spikes, but if you have many postsynaptic spikes, then you have to take care, specifically because postsynaptic pairs of pre and postsynaptic spikes may interact. In the sense, if you have a synapse that is that has two presynaptic spikes that are very close in time to 2 postsynaptic spikes, it could happen that on one side is potentiating and on the other is depressing, so there will be conflicting effects. So what you have to do to take care that this is not a problem that somehow destroys the previous phenomena is to make sure that this doesn't happen very often. You just have to run the numbers and say, well, it happens, I don't know, like in 1% of the spikes or whatever. This imposes some constraints on the number of spikes per neuron, so the firing rate, and the number of synapses. Another issue is the fact that even though by spike time-dependent plasticity we almost always mean excitatory plasticity, inhibitory neurons are also plastic, so their synapses also change. And it's not perfectly well characterized, so there's a wide range of models. There's a paper by Fogg et al. In which they explain different protocols and what the different rules that you can obtain from them. So there's no way to just take a single model and say, okay, I'm going to use this one, because that would ignore a lot of literature. So what we did was to say, okay, what conditions does my inhibitory plasticity rule have to fulfill? And ours is very simple. At worst, like the worst case that you can have that still works is when the inhibition grows as much as the excitation. That means that instead of making the neurons fire earlier because you increase the average input, you increase the variance, and this would make the neurons reach the threshold faster. If the inhibition is weaker than that, so the average actually grows, then you're in the same case as before, so same thing. Another final issue, which I guess would be familiar with for pretty much everyone who works with these learning rules, is that some of those rules, having learning or so on, can be unstable, so you have to take care that this instability is kept in check. Okay. Now, when I have a neuron and it gets a spike train, the first time it gets it, the time between between the start of the stimulus and the first spike is pretty much the same as the interspike interval after you correct for refractory periods. So that means that basically, that all the interspike intervals, including the 0 spikes at the beginning of the stimulus, are the same. However, when you let this stimulus be repeated and the neuron has STDP, what happens is that the first postsynaptic spike moves forward, so the neuron tries to fire as early as possible. However, the interspike interval gets larger. That is because every postsynaptic spike depresses the presynaptic spikes or that arrive afterwards. That means that the input after a postsynaptic spike is weaker always. So there's some sort of force that keeps postsynaptic spikes apart. Okay. Now we know this. What do we do with it? Well, in terms of codes, it's fairly straightforward. You get a peak of spikes at the beginning. Basically, since every neuron is trying to fire as early as possible, they all concentrate very close to the beginning of the stimulus. And then you get a flattening. If you don't have STTP, like the first time, you get a small peak, but nothing remarkable. Another thing that happens is that if the stimulus is fairly long, like 3-4 seconds, what happens is that the number of spikes decreases. That is because there's a lot of secondary spikes, so there's 100 spikes, and the interspike interval is large. That means that the spike rate is lower, so there's less postsynaptic spike. So put together, you get a code that is, on one side, has some sort of synchronization, has this peak of activity, which is easier to detect, and on the other hand, is actually it uses much less neurons. Okay, so it's a better code in general. Now there's another thing that you get if you do the latency reduction, and this is predictions. Imagine, for instance, that you live in a place where there's a lot of thunderstorms and lightning falls always in the same place. So you're sitting at home and you see lightning, so your visual cortex fires like crazy. And a couple of seconds later, your auditory cortex fires like crazy because you listen to the thunder. And after you repeat that very often, a neuron in the auditory cortex would try to fire as early as possible, right? And if this neuron gets some connections, some synapses from the visual cortex, it would at some point realize that it gets some spikes from the visual cortex and then it fires. So it will start firing upon receiving the spikes from the visual cortex. That means I have my neuron in the auditory cortex, which is a thunder neuron, which now fires upon seeing the lightning. So it does a prediction. Now to go back to this information theory setup, imagine that I have this sequence, and I know that after A and T, the rest of the sequence is always the same. Now that means that in principle, nothing prevents me from sending the code that encodes this particular sequence earlier. But if I do that, if I send this symbol as 1 before the rest of the sequence, this symbol is effectively predicting the rest of it. And what I've mentioned that STDP does is to push this symbol up, so to basically make it fire earlier. Now this is nice in terms of for information theories, but it has somehow interesting speculation, which is that whenever I think of the ability to predict, it's obviously very useful in evolutionary terms. I mean, it's great to be able to learn those things, and it makes sense that nature would keep that and improve that, like that evolution would force me to have this. However, it's not entirely clear how did it emerge. Specifically, the neurons that I have, they are very fast. They work on timescales of the order of 10 milliseconds, whereas the world in which we live moves at most in the order of seconds. So how can evolution put pressure on me to make predictions of 10 milliseconds if that has zero relevance in the speed at which I can move and I can react? So there's basically no upside of me, there's no evolutionary pressure for me to make a prediction of 10 milliseconds. So why, how did I start? How did I get to make predictions on 1 second? And the nice answer here is that maybe there was, on the short time scale, there was no, that was not a problem at all. But rather the evolutionary pressure was more on the side of saying, well, maybe just want to have better codes. And it turns out that, maybe those two are exactly the same thing. All right. Now, I'm not going to go through the summary because, well, you can read and it's not been that long of a video anyway. Now I know that there's a lot of simplifications in this. Generally, most of the stuff should work for more complex models. The math is just untractable. Those are the references for anyone who's interested. And I would like to thank my collaborator, Masoud, and my boss, Jürgen. Also the people who paid, especially the Max Planck School of Cognition, which is a new PhD program that you can do over different universities in Germany with rotations, with insanely good faculty, and double the normal PhD salary, which has a contract with me that includes promoting it. So, if that sounds good, send it to possible students and people around. With that, I would like to thank you and goodbye.